One of the things I think people should understand and recognize is that the elites in different European countries don't actually hold their wealth inside those countries. So the German bourgeoisie, the German elite, is actually parking their wealth in New York. They don't park their wealth necessarily in the DAX. That's not where they're putting their wealth in. So they have an interest in maintaining the stability of the US dominated order, even at the cost of their own countries. And that produces its own politics. So the first thing to recognize is when we even talk of the term Europe, what are we talking about? Europe doesn't have a patriotic bourgeoisie. Its bourgeoisie is only patriotic to itself. It's not patriotic. There's no French elite or German elite in terms of its commitment to France or Germany, or even Europe as a composite. That elite no longer exists. This is a transnational elite which is material fealties, its material loyalty is more to the United States in a sense than to its own countries.
Hello everyone and welcome back to this new appointment with the interviews of the OTTOLINATV English channel, the English language spin-off of the Italian anti-imperialist YouTube channel OTTOLINATV. Today we have the great honor of having the legendary VIJAY Prashad with us, and since it is the first interview of the year, we thought we would take advantage of it to do a sort of tour of the world through the main crisis to try to understand what kind of year we have for ahead. And what clearly emerged from the long chat with VIJAY is that this year will once again very likely be a year during which, as the great Italian Marxist-Leninist intellectual Antonio Gramsci wrote about a century ago, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And among the most characteristic morbid phenomena of this new phase, that VIJAY defines as the third Great Depression of global capitalism, a special mention, rightly, belongs on the one hand to the national bourgeoisie of the countries allied with the US, who have agreed to let their national economies be razed to the ground to become part of the large family of transnational oligarchy, and on the other, to definitively clear genocide as a legitimate means to counter the relative decline of US imperialism. What could possibly go wrong? Thank you, VIJAY. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you here. But because it's the new year, 2024, what I was wondering to make, it's like a tour of a global tour in 10 crises to understand what is going on a global scale. And obviously, I will start from the, like Pepe Escobar, we say that the Israel war against Arab children in Gaza.
This conflict in Palestine, of course, has a very long history. It goes back to 1948, might even go back, in fact, to the Balfour Declaration of 1917. But if we start in 1948, it's very clear that the Israeli state that's established that year is a state that seeks the removal of the Palestinians, the permanent expulsion of the Palestinians, what the Lebanese historian Constantine Zurek called the Nakba, a permanent Nakba. Whether Palestinians are actually removed from the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, or whether they have to become completely pliant, docile minority inside Israel, that is something that the Palestinians would have to work out. But the Israelis will simply not tolerate a Palestinian political project either on the border with Israel or within Israel itself. That's very clear and has been clear in the decades since 1948. Now, this particular conflict is interesting. The Israelis were quite surprised on October 7th when the Palestinian factions broke the fence and attacked, various kibbutzim. Israeli troops were largely attacked and so on. It's important to point out that the Palestinians have used a range of strategies to exercise their political rights. They've tried the political approach through Oslo. They even tried to elect a government. The government election was won by Hamas. Israel said, "We don't recognize you," in 2006. So the election road was set aside by Israel. Then Hamas went into a very serious arms struggle against Israel. Then there were, of course, the important uprisings inside both the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and of course, Gaza. Israel periodically bombed Gaza, punished Gaza, built an occupation infrastructure in the West Bank with walls, raids of people, illegal settlements, and so on. That approach also appeared not to work for the Palestinians. So then in 2019, sincere, well meaning Palestinians tried to do a different project. They said, "We're going to walk peacefully to the Israeli barrier fence as a protest." That was the great March of Return. Well, Israeli snipers sat at that fence and just picked off the unarmed Palestinians. So the Palestinians have tried a series of approaches. Each time their political rights has been basically cut back. So on October 7th, they did another thing. They did an attack on Israel. I'm frustrated how people say, "Well, will you condemn this? Will you condemn that?" Everything starts on October 7th. That is an ahistorical approach to the events taking place right now. Israel's reaction to October 7th has been completely asymmetrical, astoundingly genocidal. I mean, open statements that this is the Gaza Nakba and so on. Now, what's happened is interesting. On the one side, Israel has killed 22,000 civilians. Over 400 families have lost more than 10 family members, and so on. They're wiping out people from northern Gaza, central Gaza, going down the Gaza Strip. That's on the one side. On the other side, Israel has not been able to defeat the Palestinian factions. They continue to resist, fight back. There's, helicopters trying to come in and pick up injured Israeli soldiers getting shot at by rocket fire and so on. So, frustrated by the inability to make a victory in Gaza, they are now pushing against Lebanon, trying to expand the war. The assassination in Lebanon of a Hamas official is extremely reckless. Lebanon has now the right to defend itself. Why can't the Lebanese now attack Israel from the north? As it is, Hezbollah has been attacking Israel from the north. 80,000 Israelis have had to be evacuated. The government of Netanyahu is under pressure. They're not winning quickly, and they're kind of pinned down. So now the United States bombing Iraq, killing people of Islamic militia in Iraq. The United States most likely was behind the bombing in Kerman near the Soleimani grave. Obviously, there's no evidence yet of who did that, but it's most likely some US-backed proxy that took action, whether with permission from Washington or by themselves. This conflict is spreading, but it's spreading out of a sense of futility in Israel. The fact that the Ansar Allah militia, now government in Yemen, is pinned down ships in the Red Sea is of great concern to the capitalist elites in the world. Israel cannot advance its agenda. It's losing public opinion, and in a real sense, it's not able to gain what it wants to do in Gaza, which is obliterate the Palestinians. So, in some sense, this is not entirely a slaughter only of Palestinians. It's that. It's a horrible situation. But it's also a situation where the Israelis are not getting what they want, and nor is the West.
But I want to understand how do you see this dynamic inside the Arab and Islam world? No? I mean, how problematic is for the US imperialism this shift of the Arab world towards, as we have already seen with the war in Ukraine, but this is getting stronger now, and towards, the new emerging powers and all. We have seen the Arab delegation going to China, the dialogue with Russia.
I think we need to be a little cautious about some of our assessments of the impact of, let's call it what you call the Arab street on their governments. So it's true. Right from the first week, by say the 14th of October, enormous, demonstrations, manifestations across the Arab world. In fact, in Egypt, President Sisi had banned demonstrations, and still there were people coming to the street in Alexandria and Port Said, in Cairo, and so on. In Jordan, vast demonstrations continue. The Queen of Jordan, Queen Rania, is herself Palestinian, and she has been very outspoken about the violence against the Palestinians. In the Gulf monarchies, it's very difficult to protest there. When the Arab Spring happened, protesters and organizers of protests in Saudi Arabia were arrested, and some of them have vanished. Never see them again. But still, there is a kind of electric energy on social media in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in the United Arab Emirates, and so on. There is this great feeling. It's not just Algeria and Syria, the countries that are often the ones to speak out, but Yemen, Ansar Allah in Yemen, making very strong statements, and as I just said, material commitments to try to pin down shipping in the Red Sea and so on. So there's no doubt that across the Arab world, let's say even from Morocco, which was one of the signatories to the Abraham Accords, all the way out to Iraq and deep into Iran and Turkey, non-Arab countries, huge solidarity, in the Muslim world, enormous solidarity in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. I mean, extraordinary levels of solidarity with the Palestinians. No doubt about all that. Now, this has, of course, trapped the leadership, particularly in the Gulf and in Jordan and in Egypt. I mean, Egypt and Jordan have the two peace agreements with the Israeli state. Egypt, a peace agreement in the 1970s, Jordan in the 1990s. It was hoped that the Abraham Accords, which brought in Morocco, which brought in Bahrain, would eventually rein in Saudi Arabia and then close down, the Arab resistance to Israel, normalize relations, and there was the hope. Now it looks like, as the Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia himself has said, that the Abraham Accords or the normalization process is on hold. They can't advance it right now. Maybe the process will die. Maybe Morocco will be forced to withdraw from the Abraham Accords. What does this mean for Jordan, where Queen Rania has been so angry with the Israelis and the United States? Will Jordan threaten to shut down its peace agreement? What if Jordan goes in that direction? It's very unlikely, but imagine Egypt, pressure on the Egyptian government. I mean, why is Egypt so important? In 1948, when the Israeli state was established, Egypt went to war against Israel. At the time, the Israelis vanquished the Egyptian army. It was enormously humiliating for this great army of Misr, of Egypt, to be defeated by this fledgling Zionist country that had been set up. Inside the Egyptian army, there was distress. The elements in the army, nationalist elements, set up the Free Officers Movement, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. They conducted the coup d'etat against King Farouk in 1952. So, if General Sisi, who knows this history very well, is sitting, in Heliopolis and so on, wondering what's going on, I would caution President Sisi. I would say, I don't know what conversations are happening in the Egyptian military. I'm a little out of touch with them right now. But I can imagine that senior officers of the Egyptian military are saying, what are we doing? We spend billions of US dollars buying equipment. We have the best F 16s. Why aren't we flying them to create a no fly zone over Gaza? So there are all kinds of contradictions, but I don't want to exaggerate them because there are class interests in play. On the one side, the Saudis went to China to shake hands with the Iranians. At the same time, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia talks to the Iranian high officials and so on. That's on the one side. On the other side, Mohammed bin Salman has an ambition to make Saudi Arabia the new Europe, the crossroads of trade with India into Europe and so on. He has other ambitions. Normalizing with Israel might be important for that. The India Middle East corridor, for instance, was going to start in Gujarat, go up to Dubai, from Dubai, go into Saudi Arabia, from Saudi Arabia, go up the old Hijaz Railroad to Haifa port, which is owned now by an Indian billionaire, Gautam Adani. Haifa port being crossing into the ports in Greece, several of them also owned by the Indian billionaire Gautam Adani. So, Saudi Arabia is caught between two desires. And I think we need to understand that we can't overestimate that the people are going to somehow change the minds of their leaders.
From the Middle East, going back to the first war of the new era, that is the Ukrainian war, what we can expect from 2024 from that scenario?
It's very important that you are asking people these questions about Ukraine. It's very, particularly in Europe, it's immensely important. We know that we are approaching, 3 years of this conflict in Ukraine. On 24th of February 2022, 2 years of the conflict in Ukraine, this conflict in Ukraine, when Russian forces entered Ukrainian territory. But of course, we know this conflict goes back to at least 2014, during the Euromaidan incident, where the West effectively conducted what you could call a coup d'etat, or at least, if not a coup d'etat, they put in place their own government, the Western government, which then did a couple of things. On the one side, tried to bring Ukraine close to not only Europe, which would have been acceptable, but into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was unacceptable to the Russians. But the other thing that this new Ukrainian government did after 2014 is, of course, start a campaign against Russian speakers, banning Russian as a language, lifting up the symbols of Ukrainian Nazism, Stefan Bandera and all of that stuff. So this conflict has actually a much longer history than the Russian intervention into Ukraine. It's got to be dated again from 24. It's very interesting when we talk about conflicts. One of the great debates which doesn't take place between those who support these conflicts and those who are against it. One of the great debates is when to start the history. When does it begin? Western observers who are very much pro this war, pro continuation of the war, want to start this from the 24th of February 2022. People like us who are against this conflict want to start it in 2014. Same with Gaza. People who want to prolong this war started at October 7th, 2023. And we say, no, let's go back to 1948 or 1917. And we want to end this conflict. I think it's important, I'm saying to you directly, I would like the conflict in Ukraine to end. I think it's good for the people of Ukraine if the conflict ends. It's good for the people of Russia, certainly good for the people of Europe, because they'll see less division in their own countries. Inflation might go down. Europe desperately needs to have access to Russian gas and so on. Certainly would be good for Europeans. But why would I say this conflict should end? Okay, what was the reason why the Russians entered on the 24th of February 2022, and what were their war aims? Was Russia eager to annex all of Ukraine? Seems to be not so. And the reason I don't believe that is so is that Russia didn't actually destroy Ukrainian infrastructure. When Vladimir Zelensky flies to the United States to beg for weapons, he flies out of Kiev airport. This is not a trivial thing. What I'm saying is not trivial. It's actually very appropriate. Why haven't the Russians bombed Kiev airport and prevented civilian flights in and out of Ukraine? Because they don't want to do that. When the United States illegally attacked Iraq, one of the first things they did was they bombed all the airports. They prevented all aircraft from going in and out of the country. I know that. I visited Iraq shortly afterwards. There was no a possibility. The runways in Baghdad airport had been bombed. It took some time for them to be repaired and so on. The Russians are not interested in the total annexation of Ukraine. That idea should go from people's heads. And we know that because of the way the war is being fought. They are not smashing all the infrastructure, isolating Western Ukraine and so on. What are their war aims? In fact, it seems to me there are three war aims. And I think in many respects, the Russians have already attained them. Number one, in 2014, Crimea broke away from Ukraine and went to Russia. This, of course, is interesting because Crimea had been part of Russia previously and was provided by the Soviets to be part of the new Ukraine SSR. It doesn't have a Ukrainian history. When Ukraine broke away, when Crimea broke away from Ukraine in 2014 and returned, to the sovereignty of Russia, there was a serious problem for Crimea because Crimea relied on Ukraine for its water supplies. There were water pipelines running into Crimea. Now, the Ukrainian government decided to cut off Crimea from water. To now take care of that, the Russians built an enormous bridge across the Caspian Sea, which was driving in trucks water into Crimea. It's ridiculous. So, one of the war aims was to create a land bridge from Russia into Crimea to prevent Crimea from facing this kind of hostage situation with water. And in order to attain that, the Russians had to effectively annex Mariupol, the big city that produces the land bridge from the Donbass region into Crimea. So war aim number one was a land bridge to Crimea. The Russians have attained that and they're holding that. Second war aim was the annexation, or, well, whatever you call it, the election that brought the Donbass region into Russia. It's a largely Russian speaking region. This region has been under attack by Ukrainian fascists of different kinds, and so on. And they had whatever election they had. Eventually, they decided we want to be part of Russia. Now, whether you accept the election or not is irrelevant. The fact is that demographically, these people were feeling under pressure since 2014. At least the Russian speakers, and that recovery by Russia of the Donbass is complete. So that's the second war aim: building the land bridge to Crimea and having the Russians, speakers of Ukraine be part of Russia. Now, it's not that this is unusual in the world. This sort of ethnic nationalism. I'm 100% opposed to ethnic nationalism, but I'm realistic enough to understand that a lot of the world works this way. As more culture and ethnicity begin to define politics, unfortunately, from my standpoint, very unfortunately, this is what creates the situation where people say, I'd prefer to be part of Russia, not Ukraine. I mean, it also in other parts of Europe creates terrible violence against migrants and minorities. This idea that we are Italian, this is Italy for Italians, all North Africans should leave, blah, blah, blah. This is a race. It has the temptations of racism. But this is where we are in world history. We have to confront it, but we can't just, will it away. So this movement of the Donbass into Russia is very much part of this history, this sort of feeling that I am Russian, I want to be with other Russians, whatever. Second war aim. The third war aim is actually much more difficult for the Russians to attain. The third war aim is what they call the denazification of Ukraine. And this is difficult to attain. And the reason is that Ukrainian politics has moved pretty far to the right. And there's no way that Russia is actually going to be able to, quote unquote, verify the denazification of Ukraine. What that would mean is to actually say that all of the entire Ukrainian political class must go and it must be replaced by somebody else. This is not going to be possible. So, what you have here is you have the basis for negotiation. Right now, a negotiation should be on the table. That I think it's now quite clear that Ukraine is no longer going to be able to take back Crimea, take back the land bridge, take back the Donbass. I think those areas are now going to be part of Russia. And I feel like it's naive to believe that even with more and more Western funding, with more conscription, a very unpopular move by Zelensky inside. It's such an unpopular move in Ukraine that Zelensky's government doesn't want to say they are doing the conscription. and the military doesn't want to say they are doing the conscription. Nobody wants to be responsible for conscription. Ukrainians don't want to fight anymore in this war. The West can put as much money and equipment as possible, but unless Polish fighters enter or German fighters enter, maybe Italian fighters enter, this war cannot continue. Ukrainians don't want to fight it. So there's a basis for negotiation. The Russians are eager to negotiate. They're not going to be able to win back these parts of the territory, okay? Donbass and the land bridge through Mariupol. The Russians are going to have to concede to the fact that the governments in the future, for the foreseeable future in Kiev, are going to be governments of the right. They are going to be governments that are pro European. They might even continue to flirt with the idea of entry into NATO. I think that's something the Russians are going to have to now accept. I don't think it's possible to have a wholesale, revolution of any kind, liberal revolution even in Ukraine. So there's the basis of the. Now the thing is, the West is not going to admit to a negotiation. The West has made it very clear that they would like to continue this war as a way, as Lloyd Austin said, U.S. Defense Secretary in Kiev. He said, our goal is to weaken Russia. If the goal is to weaken Russia, then they don't give a day's worth of attention to the lives of actual Ukrainians who are dying. And I think it's very important for sensible people around the world to be calling for an end to this conflict, principally because we are at a point, and I think this is what I want to underline, where everybody will have to negotiate down. The Ukrainians will have to admit that some of the territory is gone, and the Russians are going to have to admit that their political aims may not be met. That's actually a good place for negotiation. You can't negotiate when one person is winning everything. That's just going to create a problem. You're going to feel like you don't have any leg to stand on. But here, actually, both sides will win if they negotiate. And I very much hope, again, sensible people will take that position.
I mean, what has been quite impressive is how the European countries has accepted not to have all the economic consequences of the war. I mean, the cost of energy, the inflation, the bank rates, and the aggressive, how do you say, protectionist policies in the US that is attracting investment from Europe also a lot. I mean, what do you think Europe will make to fight against this economical decline, or they have no idea how to counter the economical decline, and we are like the new Japan?
Well, what you said about Europe as the new Japan is very interesting. One of the things I think people should understand and recognize is that the elites in different European countries don't actually hold their wealth inside those countries. So the German bourgeoisie, the German elite, is actually parking their wealth in New York. They don't park their wealth necessarily in the DAX. That's not where they're putting their wealth in. So they have an interest in maintaining the stability of the US dominated order, even at the cost of their own countries. And that produces its own politics. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So the first thing to recognize is when we even talk of the term Europe, what are we talking about? Europe doesn't have a patriotic bourgeoisie. Its bourgeoisie is only patriotic to itself. It's not patriotic. There's no French elite or German elite in terms of its commitment to France or Germany, or even Europe as a composite. That elite no longer exists. This is a transnational elite which is material fealties, its material loyalty is more to the United States in a sense than to its own countries. As a consequence of this, European social democracy or European liberalism has been deeply dented. There are really no liberal political forces in Europe. There are used to be liberal political forces. There used to be a social democratic party in Germany. There used to be a socialist party in France. And I say used to be, even though somebody can come back and say, hey, wait a minute. There still is a social democratic party in Germany. There still is a socialist party, socialist in France and so on. There still is a Labour Party in England. No, actually, you're wrong. They are in name only. They are not really the old parties. This is not Francois Mitterrand's party, okay? This is not Willy Brandt's party. This is not Tony Benn's Labour Party, okay? These are very different structures. These structures are committed to the maintenance of the NATO US dominated order. In other words, what used to be European liberalism has effectively become the subordinate political parties of Washington. That's what they are, and Italy has seen that actually quite catastrophically. You've seen that with your Democratic Party and your this party and your that party. And Italy was early to this. I mean, the collapse of the Italian center took place much earlier than it took place in Germany or in France or in Britain, much earlier. The parties of the Italian center smashed themselves because they basically became pale shadows of their Washington, their puppeteers from Washington. They were basically taking orders from NATO headquarters, taking orders from the US Treasury, and so on. So the fact that the bourgeoisie in these countries, is got loyalty mainly to the United States, or at least to Wall Street, means that social democracy, liberalism of a centrist kind has collapsed in Europe. What does this mean? It actually has catastrophic effects. What it means is it opens the free lane for the right wing inside Europe, whether it's Alliance for Deutschland in Germany or it's, Marine Le Pen in France, whatever her party is called. I mean, I would never have imagined that fellow would come to power in Netherlands. He was a clownish character when he first emerged, Gert. Clownish character. Now he's the, head of government in the Netherlands. It's ridiculous. What is this? What is happening? So the right has been given a free lane, at least in Western Europe. It's a slightly different story in the East. The free lane. And what does this free lane comprise of? It comprises of the fact that the right wing provides, I think, quite direct criticism of the fact that the bourgeoisie has surrendered to Washington, but then has no policies to offer, as an alternative, except the worst of its heritage. Its fascist heritage returns, anti-immigrant, conservative towards women, this, that, and the other. They can't let go of their fascist heritage. And I want to say this quite strongly. The left, Europe actually is a continent without politics. It's a continent with a lot of problems, but there are no politics. Where are the political forces available for rejuvenation? So what you get instead of a politics is you get one or two individuals emerging with very important ideas. Mélenchon, for instance, in France, for a time, Podemos, with Pablo Iglesias, for a time, you saw this with Tsipras in Greece. That collapsed very quickly. In Germany now, Sarah Wagenknecht, maybe Seven Dagdalen and so on. Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, individuals, trying to hold the standard to create a politics. But that's not politics. That's a person with a set of ideas, with a following, who can mobilize people, but they don't capture the imagination of the working class in their neighborhoods. They don't have structures in the neighborhoods. They haven't built the old-fashioned politics. Europe claims to be the home of democracy, Athens and so on. Where is it now? It doesn't exist. You have angry people with no outlet. They are angry. Their politics is a politics of anger. And that's not, to me, politics at all. That's just anger.
In these 2 years, what happened is that the hierarchy between the collective West has been reinforced towards the complete leadership of the US. And on the other side, you have this very conflictual with very different agendas in the global South. How do you think, did this mean that the global South cannot, there's no BRICS, there's no Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there's no matter to take all these very differentiated panorama ecosystem together, confronting on the opposite side the collective West that has a very clear hierarchy where the U.S. agenda is the everyone agenda, or there's a way to keep all this very confused and work together in order to advance against the U.S. imperialism?
I very much appreciate how you asked this question because in this month again, Tricontinental releases a dossier called The Churning of the World Order, which is a kind of executive summary of that long study I mentioned called hyperimperialism. And what we argue is exactly what you're saying, that the West, under the hegemony of NATO, for instance, and the US Treasury Department, has created a bloc. There is a Western bloc. It includes not only the G7 countries, the members of NATO, but also the members of the 19 intelligence agencies that collaborate with each other, including Israel and so on. That's a bloc. They act as a bloc. The South is not a block, it's a set of groupings, rings, we consider it. It's not quite the same. And in our text, we go in detail of why that is so. I mean, the politics are very different, between the countries. Yes, they are all members of the non-aligned movement, which had been set up in 1961, meets every year, and so on. But there's enormous gaps and differences, say, between Cuba and Venezuela on one side over here and Indonesia on the other. What unites these countries? We argue there's a new mood in the South, but a mood is not the same as a bloc. That's why I find it a little frustrating when people say, well, it's basically a two-camp struggle. It's the Western bloc versus this bloc of this. I think that's very wrong. In fact, on many occasions, the Chinese foreign ministry has said, we don't want to build a camp. We don't want to build a counter force to the West to get into a situation where you're going to enter World War III. They don't want that. They want to extend what they call, borrowing from the Soviets, the camp of peace. Extend, bring other countries out of this kind of militarized bloc politics. 75% of world military spending is spent by the NATO countries. 75%. NATO countries plus their allies. 75%. China merely spends about 10 to 12% of world military spending. There is no bloc of the South versus a bloc of the North. There's definitely, as you say, a bloc of the North, which is under a kind of collective leadership with the United States in the lead. NATO is an important instrument for that collectivization. The South doesn't have it. There are different groupings. As you say, there's BRICS 10 now, Argentina having walked away. BRICS 10, there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which had been initially set up to fight the Taliban. Then there's the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, set up by the Venezuelans and so on. Different groupings. There are different regional trade and political mechanisms, African Union, UNASUR, and so on. I mean, you have all these things. You don't have a center of the global South. And I hope there will not be a center. I mean, one of the contradictions, dialectics of the present, is between US led hegemony on the one side and regionalism on the other. Countries in the South want to build regional projects. They don't want to contest the US and say, after the Washington era, after US imperialism, now we want some other kind of we want to get beyond this. It's a Eurocentric paradigm, we feel, that says there has to be either one major power dominating the world after the other, Italy, the Dutch, the English, and then the United States. And secondly, that there needs to be, war as the basis of international relations. That is rejected. We would like to found international order based on peace. Now, call me naive. That's okay. You can say, oh, that's a naive opinion. That's okay. You can say it's naive, but naive is better. Naive is better than cynical. I mean, for God's sake, we need more naive people than cynical people. But the naivete that I'm putting forward is actually materialist. It's not. It's not based on ridiculousness. It's based on material realities. Asian countries are going to be the dominant economies in the 21st century. Between India, China, Indonesia, you're going to have about 40% of world GDP in many of these Asian countries. So let's come to terms with the fact that Europe is not the center of the world and has not been for a long time. So Europeans need to kind of calm down their self assessment, that they are such great people and they should tell other people what to do. And the United States needs to recognize it's not a city on the hill. It's just another country on the planet Earth. When I meet European international bureaucrats in different countries, there is a kind of arrogance which is enormously tiring. Why are you being so arrogant, man? Take it easy. Just because you're from like Denmark or whatever it is, doesn't give you superiority over the rest of us. And it's a kind of sophisticated superiority. It's not normal superiority. It's sophisticated because it comes with this wrapping of not being superior. And that's most frustrating to people. So anyway, I always say to Europeans, dial it down a little bit. You're not special. And to the United States, you're not a city on the hill. You're just another country on a very complicated, very, very complicated planet.
And I mean, in this confrontation between a bloc and a a very, chaotic ecosystem of the global south, there has been always the strength of the US imperialism has been, as also Varoufakis has said something clever about this, the ability to co-opt the economical elite of the global south, allowing them to be part of this transnational party of capital flight towards fiscal paradise and then speculative bubble in the US. But it looks like the US is no more capable of assuring to global elite outside the Western bloc to be part of the party, no? And I mean, how do you, I mean, the main tool that the US financial imperialism has had to divide et impera, no? The global south that is co-opting the global economical elite. Do you think is not working anymore? And so this could be how do you say, something that take together the global south in an agenda towards a new multipolar kind of international order, or it's a fantasy?
Well, it doesn't matter what I think, actually, because reality, in fact, informs us about something important. Um, you know, about a few years after the third Great Depression, which starts in 2007, it's not a recession, okay? It wasn't a financial crisis. It's the entry of a Great Depression, which many countries, including in Europe, have not exited from. 2007, the third Great Depression starts, okay? Now, after that, it was very clear to countries, even in Europe, that they were not going to be assisted by the United States, either with short term financial inflows. Although I must say, right after the financial crisis, the US Federal Reserve did bail Europe out right after the financial crisis. European Central Bank was useless. It had no policy imagination. It relied on the United States and the Federal Reserve to come in and liquefy European banks. Europeans are too busy saying our banking system is better than the US one. It's not true. But anyway, they talked about that quite directly, that there's a kind of Anglo-Saxon banking system. That was a language used at the time. Sarkozy and others were using that language. So completely false culturalism, didn't explain it. Anyway, shortly thereafter, it's very clear the US didn't have the capacity to invest in Europe, for instance, in industry or in building transportation networks and so on. It was very clear realization it's not going to happen. Secondly, it was very clear realization after the US illegal war in Iraq that US maintenance of security was in serious doubt. And you began to see Eastern European countries, but also then Italy, Western Europe, start looking towards China. Italy joins the Belt and Road Project after 2013. 16 countries in the central belt of Europe joined the Belt and Road Project. Germany moves so much of its manufacturing to Hubei province, Wuhan as its capital, and so on. And so, you already begin to see Europe moving away from the United States. Very uh, kind of precise movement. At the same time, Europe had begun to rely more and more on Russian natural gas. So this had already happened. I mean, this realization was already there. You saw a prime minister of Australia, fluent Chinese speaker, talking about how Australia, key ally of the United States, major intelligence partner in the Five Eyes intelligence system, Australia beginning to say that we need to have clearer and better relations with China. 2009, you have a new prime minister in Japan who wants U.S. military bases to be gone from Okinawa, better relations with China. And at that point, the Obama administration does what the United States has done since then, starts a so called pivot to Asia. In other words, a pressure campaign to bring down China. Um, and so there's already been a realization that the US elites simply don't have it. They don't have the capital to invest, to build infrastructure, the ports in Italy, and so on. It's going to come from Asia. As it is, as I said, Mr. Gautam Adani has bought the ports, number of them in Greece. You have Chinese port companies coming to develop ports. The Chinese are the only ones who can really build high quality, high speed rail at an inexpensive price and so on. So you have all that, right? That realization. But the reaction from the United States was militarization, and Europe went along with it to its detriment. The war in Ukraine has tried to break the increasing incorporation of Europe into this kind of Eurasian unity. Linking with Russia, linking with China. The rational material linkages that were building up had to be broken, and that's what the war in Ukraine was. That's what the pressure campaign on Taiwan is. To create another wedge issue to try to draw China into some kind of conflict. It is already true. Again, it's not my opinion. It's already the case that these countries have said by their own actions that we need to be part of the Chinese project. We need to get gas. But the United States, trying to exert and maintain and extend its hegemony, has militarized those conflicts instead of just doing what they themselves preach, which is free trade. You want to defeat the Chinese in a bid, make a better bid. You want countries in Eastern Europe not to join the Belt and Road Initiative, produce your own initiative. But no, rather than that, they militarize the conflict, and that's really where we are. We are at an inflection point. More and more conflicts being imposed by the West, and the rest of the world saying, no, we want to increase the camp of peace.
And I mean, the last question is that in all these, you mentioned the third Great Depression. That is, I think, a very clever way to understand what is happening, and also to be alarmed. Respect of the naivety you were talking before, no? That the two other Great Depression of the global capital have produced huge tragedy. No, the first one, as you mentioned in the Tricontinental Report, is the imperialism. So the needs of conquer with fire and guns all the rest of the people and put in slavery, we can say, all the rest of the planet. And the second Great Depression has brought to the rising of Nazis, fascism, and the Second World War. So what we have to fear from this third Great Depression, the genocidal solution that we see in the Gaza is the new normal of how we can, the only way how the U.S. imperialists can fight postpone the consequences of this Great Depression and the decline that it brings together with it.
Nothing is inevitable. That's important. And you're right. The first Great Depression, 1873 to 1896, the West was able to come out of the Depression because of high imperialism, the carving up of Africa, the intensified use of the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America, and so on. Okay? The seizing of parts of Asia that had not previously been seized, or the intensification. I mean, during the Great Depression, there were massive famines in India already due to British imperialism. And then the second Great Depression, 1929 to 1945, basically ends with, the 1930s ends with the rise of fascism, but also militarism, war and so on. Is this third depression, Great Depression, 2007 onward, going to result in the rise of fascism? Already has resulted in the rise of various intolerant forces. Is it going to end up with more imperialism? Already has been going in that direction. And so, yes, this is a kind of uncomfortable cycle that we see. These great collapses in capitalism that result in great monsters being created. But how do we come out of this monstrous situation? None of these great depressions ended, as it were, without major gains for people. The first Great Depression, the Long Depression, you might say, an outcome of it was the Russian Revolution, the revolutions in China in 1911, the revolution in Iran in 1911, the revolution in Mexico in 1911. Outcomes of the first Great Depression, the so-called Long Depression. The second Great Depression ends with the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, revolution in Cuba, and so on. This wave, will it have its own revolutionary outcome as well? It's not impossible. On the one side, war and devastation. On the other side, revolution. What is happening today in the Sahel, this anti-French maneuver? Will it escalate? Will it go toward the left, or will it remain about sovereignty alone? Will it talk also about the social revolution? Will there be massive transformations taking place in other parts of the world? We don't know. The right might feel it is in an advantage, but those advantages are not permanent. Because one of the things we know about the right is it can't deliver without force and fear. It can't deliver an end to hunger, an end to illiteracy, and so on. But force and fear are its coin. So it's not a permanent, the right is not permanent. The right is permanent for a lot of people because they'll kill a lot of people. But the right is not a permanent, situation. It will have its own limits.
Nothing is inevitable, Vijay emphasizes. During the past two Great Depressions, capitalism had finally emerged from the crisis through escalating waves of violence. A new wave of violence seems to have already begun, but there is no sign of a way out of the systemic problems of capitalist accumulation. If the barbarism announced by Rosa Luxemburg as the only realistic alternative to socialism more than a century ago was followed by a period of relative peace and economic growth, today the real risk is that barbarism heralds the end of the human species in this planet. It's time to raise our heads and transform 2024 from the year of the Great Decline to the year of the Great Awakening of the subaltern across the planet.